Hey everybody, Sapora here, biology class, and this week we're getting into one of my favorite topics, which is all the different evidence for biological evolution, right? The claim that organisms, species, populations change over time to differ from their ancestors. And so in looking at this, we're going to be looking at all kinds of cool examples of mammals, mainly, that don't exist that used to exist in the past. We generally think in these chunks like, oh, there's the dinosaurs here, and then there's the mammals we have now. But between where we're at now and the dinosaurs, there is a whole series of mammals that have existed and don't exist anymore, right? And have gotten us to where we are today. So we're going to look at all kinds of different examples of those throughout time and look at what the evidence is that supports, right, the claim that species change over time. And that's the theory of evolution. A theory is an explanation. So just to review, what is science, right? Science is not a thing. Science is a method. Science is a way of answering questions. We use science to answer questions. Science is a verb, not a noun. And a more technical definition would be science is the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. So we study what the physical world is made of and how it behaves, and we do this through observations and experiments. And if you remember using the scientific method, right, we make an observation, we ask a question, we come up with a proposed explanation, an untested one, a hypothesis, and then we test it, we analyze it, and then we come to a conclusion. Conclusions come last, and they're based on evidence. So you go where the evidence leads you. Boom, there's that, okay? And after all the facts have been gathered, right, after scientists have gathered a ton of facts, done a bunch of different tests, right, then they look at all of this and we develop a theory to make sense of all the different facts. Facts are things that happen, that we observe, that we can see, that we can replicate, that people independently observe, and then we come up with a theory to explain it. So a theory is an explanation that is tested and supported by evidence and facts. And facts never become theories, theories never become facts. They're two different things. Facts happen, theories explain why they happen. So a fact doesn't become a theory. Okay? They're two different things, apples and oranges. And a hypothesis is an untested theory, an untested explanation. So if you're really going to say, hey, that's just a theory, what you really mean is that's just a hypothesis. You haven't tested it. Theories in science are strong things. And the theory of evolution has been around for 200 years. It's well supported. It's well accepted across the scientific community in pretty much every single field. And it's supported by tons of different evidence we're going to look at today. And all that we're saying with evolution is that evolution is a process of biological change. We talked about what descendants were, right? If you're descended from someone, it doesn't mean you came directly from them. That can be many generations back. To where the descendants, the things that exist now or did exist, look different from their ancestors way before them. Okay, so populations of organisms change over time in their physical and biological chemical structure and appearance. Pretty straightforward. So evidence in a theory, right? So we're looking at evidence right now. Evidence are facts. They are things that verifiably occur in nature. So we're not making claims that we can't back up here. We're looking at observations. We're looking at experimental results. We're looking at things that are repeatable and independently observable. So I could gather up a bunch of fossils and bones and I could analyze them. They could get sent off to another lab where someone else could analyze them, and this could go on in many different labs. And hopefully we would all come to the same conclusions based on the observations of these things. These are verifiable things that exist in nature. So that is how science works. Okay, enough of that. Let's start talking about the actual evidence that we have for evolution. The first line of evidence, and you guys are going to be taking notes on this, you're going to get tested on this, I got a worksheet for it, is anatomical evidence, the anatomy of things, right? We look at the physical structure and form of things to see if there's relations between them. So relatives, biological families, right? The dog family, the cat family, the giraffe, the horse, they have shared traits, and both inside and outside, right? So how they look in the outside, but especially when it comes to their bones and skulls. And then we can compare these to see if they're related or different. Now looking at these two, well, this one's lost its canines. These are both predators. These are both carnivores, but they are actually in different families. If you look at their teeth, the back molars here are pretty in line, and the back molars here go a little sideways. The back two go sideways. This is a type of dog, a canid, and this is actually a type of bear, an ursid, 2 different families. So we can look at the bones and skulls and we can put things in groups. If we found a new type of dog, let's say this one here, you'd be like, is that a bear dog? Or what about this one down here? It looks like a raccoon dog. So we'd want to know, is that a raccoon? Is that a bear? Is that a dog? What family does it belong to? You could look at the skull, you could look at the morphology, you could look at all the different bone structures throughout its body and compare those to other known things and then decide where it belongs, and which family it belongs to, or is it in its own unique family. And we do this with animals, we do this with mushrooms and fungus. If you've ever gone out looking for mushrooms, there's keys you use to kind of tell you what type it is. Is it a chanterelle, an amanita, a bolete? We do this with plants. Pine family is a really big and common family, but there's many different members in Pinaceae, right? And there's firs, there's hemlocks, there's spruces, there's pines. They all have characteristics that put them into specific groups. They have shared traits. So this sharing of traits shows relationships. It shows that this group is related and this group is related, but yet all the pines are still related. So spruces and pines and firs, trees, conifers are all kind of in one cluster, separate from, let's say, cedar trees over in another group there of conifers, or redwoods in another group. And those are different from trees with leaves. And then you have groups of those, like maples and alders, on and on. So that shows relationships, right? Every living thing isn't just totally unique. They're actually related to one another. And we see that across all groups of living things here on Earth. One of the other lines of evidence that is cool is kind of a long word, homologous structures. Say it with me, homologous structures. Good job. So homo is the root for same, right? So the same type of structure, same underlying form is what we're talking about. On the outside, it looks different, but on the inside, it's the same. And what do humans, cats, whales, and bats all have in common? They're a type of something. They're a type of animal, a specific type of animal. Human, cat, whale, bat. They're all a mammal that have hair, and they produce milk, and they're warm-blooded. They're all mammals. And when you look at mammals, all mammals have the same structure of bones in their arms, in their forelimbs, and even in their legs too. You have, but we're specifically looking at arms in this diagram. You have 1 bone, 2 bones, many bones, wrist bones, and then usually you have about 5 phalanges here. Sometimes they're reduced. Digits. So you have a humerus, a radius, an ulna. Carpals are your wrist bones, metacarpals, and then phalanges. So we all have this same underlying structure because we all share an ancestor back there that carried this structure, right? And this structure it seems like it's designed almost for an arm or a hand, but it has many different forms. Cats use it too. So in cats, it's wired a little differently. And in whales, they have the same structure as whale, because whales are mammals. So underneath a whale fin is a humerus, a radius, an ulna, wrist bones, and finger bones, but it's all stuck inside a giant oven mitt of a fin. Why do they have this structure? Why do they have wrists and fingers and digits? They don't need them or use them. They have them because their ancestors had them, and that trait was passed down. And as we're going to learn next week with natural selection works on forms that are there, right? Evolution is not magical thinking. It's not that just something poof appears out of nowhere, right? Or a trait just suddenly appears. Wings will suddenly sprout out. No, it's that you work with what you have and you refine it, right? And you can start to repurpose it over time if the environment pushes you in that direction. And we'll see that later when we look at whales. With the bat arm or a bat wing, bats fly. They actually have a thumb that sticks out, and they're flying with their fingers. Their fingertips stretch out and make their wings. They don't have feathers like birds, and so the skin stretches around it. We see this same structure with wrist bones in all kinds of different mammals. In horses, they even have it. They're all fused into what's called a cannon bone. And so their digits are fused down into this long one here. Tapirs are related to horses, but they have toes. They still have the wrist bones. Cows have them, pigs have them, dogs, orangutans. We all share the same, and the wrist bone structure and count is actually similar, right? So again, all of these parts have just been reworked and re-engineered for different purposes over time. As we'll learn, the environment shapes things over time. The environment shapes populations of organisms by selecting the ones that have traits that are favorable and then taking out the ones that don't. Okay, I'll get more into this later. Cool stuff. So those are called homologous structures. Homo, the same underlying structure that is in all of these. Okay, cool one is vestigial structures or vestigial. A vestige means something left over from the past. We could spend a lot of time talking about these because there's a whole bunch of different types of vestigial structures. Vestigial structures are leftover parts that show ancestry but no longer help nor harm the species. If they harmed us, we would be getting rid of them pretty quickly because natural selection would just take out those of us that had them. So there's tons of examples. Again, we could spend all day on this. Famous ones are cave fish, right? So there are species of fish that live inside these cave systems where there is no light, and they have lost their eyesight. They have lost the ability to see because they don't need it. But they still have eye spots and eye sockets and sort of leftover vestigial eye tissue there. And of course, they're very closely related to the fish right outside the cave, right? If it's a minnow here, it's just a subspecies, a genetic variety. An evolved, a derived species from that one, the one inside from the outside. The other cool thing is snakes actually have hip bones, right? Some snakes have totally lost them, but members of the the boidae, so your boa constrictors, they all have hip bones, and some of them even stick out. But when you take apart a snake skeleton, which has lots of vertebrae, they actually have floating little hip bones and legs, bones that are reduced and don't function anymore. Snakes evolved from lizards, right? They're in the same family of reptiles with lizards, squamash. And they are just lizards that basically started going into rodent tunnels underground to hunt, and so their legs got reduced. You'll see reduced legs that are kind of useless with some of our forest salamander species in the area, really tiny legs, and they move more like a snake. And they may be on their way to losing those legs, right? This is a slow, stepwise process, the environment selecting each generation. Tailbones in humans, we have our own vestigial structures. When you look down at the tailbone, right, this fused plate, this is the sacrum right here, and then the coccyx, it's a bunch of fused vertebrae. They're all individual vertebrae, but now they're all fused together. It's not actually a solid plate bone, it's a fused plate of bone. And in other mammals that have tails, right, these vertebrae are extended out, and they actually serve as tails. We have vestigial tails. We have the parts of tails, but they're all fused together into this structure down in here. Other things that we have that are vestigial, of course, would be our appendix. In animals that eat a lot of cellulose, like uncooked plant matter, and have to chew it, their appendix is enlarged and squirts out enzymes that help them digest that leaf matter. We have been cooking food for a couple million years now as hominids. And so that appendix has gotten smaller because we do not need that. And so it's gotten reduced in us and taken out by natural selection as well. Another cool one is this tendon right here. Check this thing out. See it popping right there. Oh yeah, it's popping. So this little tendon right here, when I make this, sticks out. Some of us have it, some of us don't. In organisms that have this tendon and primates that have it, they hang. They hang from branches, and it's needed and it's required, right? We do not hang from branches for a living. We do not need to hang from branches for our survival at all. So in many of us, this tendon is gone. The gene that produces this tendon in some populations has been skipped and left out. Now, this happens in biology, right? Copies of genes get skipped and missed sometimes. And if missing that gene affects your survival, then whenever that gets skipped and missed, that organism that has that gene gets taken out of the population. They fall out of the tree, they don't have any kids, that thing doesn't get passed on. If losing that gene doesn't affect your survival, then you pass that on because you grow up, survive, have kids, you pass that lack of a gene, in this case, on, and it spreads throughout the population. So for us, some of us have it, some of us still don't. Doesn't really affect your survival. I guess if you're going to be doing a lot of rock climbing and pull-ups, it might be helpful. Other vestigial structures, whales are the best example of vestigial structures with their hip bones. They not only have a pelvis, but they have a femur, right? And they even have a little bit of a knee joint down in there as well, off of this floating hip bone. And the hip bone's not even connected to their spine anymore. It just sits out there and kind of floats in their fat. It's like a leftover bone in your butt cheek. And doesn't stick out. but when you dissect them, it is down in there. And of course, they're homologous arm structures as well, showing us that they descended from, right? Their great ancestors 50 million years ago, a long time ago, were four-legged mammals walking around on land. And whales have slowly worked their way, as we can see here, into the water, and we'll look at some examples of this in a minute. Okay, other physical features that give us evidence that, again, populations of organisms change over time, and that we have common ancestors if we go back far enough, because that's what it means to be related, right? So, our developmental similarities. So, organisms that resemble each other in their development, especially in their early development, if we all look the same in our early development, then as we develop, we become different. But that early developmental similarities isn't just coincidence. It shows that we're related, right, with others. And then we have different patterns of development as we grow. So just taking a cluster of eggs from a fish, turtle, chicken, pig, and human, and watching them develop, the early embryo in all of these different organisms is pretty much the exact same thing. It is the exact same thing. You can mix them up and wouldn't be able to tell which one is which. The features that we have are the little tail here, and the gill slits, the ear opening there, and then the eye hole. Now, what do fish, turtles, chickens, and pigs, humans, all have in common? Pigs and humans were mammals, but chickens are birds, turtles are reptiles, and fish are fish. Well, there's 3 different types of fish. So what do all these share in common? Which feature do we have in common if we go back far enough, right? Mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish are all vertebrates. We all have a backbone. And actually, only 4% of the animal world is vertebrates. Most animals are invertebrates, crustaceans, or sand dollars and sea stars, or mollusks, right? But what all these things have in common, fish, turtle, chicken, pig, human, is that we're all vertebrates. Cool beans. So we all have a backbone. So we're all related far enough back, in other words, right? That's kind of what that implies. And you can see that in our development. So fish, they develop out, the tail straightens out, and the gill slits become gills. And in the turtle, you start to see little limb buds appear here, 4 of them, actually. Same as in the chicken, same as in the pig, same as in the human. Snakes have 4 limb buds as well. And then theirs just don't elongate or really fully develop with them as they grow. Amphibians, interestingly enough, the gill slits go and become gills, right? Tadpoles and many salamanders have gills, and they lose them when they're older. Amphi means both, so water and land. Reptiles are fully land. And in the rest of the land animals that don't have gills, these gill slits then go on to become parts of the inner ear, bones in the inner ear. The little flaps that make the gills end up folding into plates that make up our inner ear. It's kind of cool. And in some people, they still get a little dot on their neck from where that vestigial gill slit is. And you can see those, what we call vestigial gill slits here. Here are the limb buds, here are the backbones. All developing vertebrates have this exact same form. Woo! Okay, cruising through the evidence. Let's keep going. So the Earth is shaped by processes we see today happening over a long period of time. So geologic evidence, what is there to show us that we could see this much change? That whales, for instance, could go from something with 4 legs to a whale. So that's not going to happen in one generation, right? The evidence shows us that whales' ancestors had 4 limbs and walked around. But how far back do we have to go? And do we see, a progression there throughout time as well? So the question is, how old is the Earth? How much time do we have, right, for life to change and evolve here on Earth? And we have a lot of time. Radioactive dating is how geologists date rock formations, and there's a number of different types of radioactive dating as well. And radioactive dating is simply looking at isotopes, different variations of common atoms or elements, and there is a ratio of, it gets complicated, but anyway, these isotopes break down over time. and they break down at a steady rate. And we can look at a rock and we can tell when it formed by how much of this isotope is still left in it, because it's decaying over time. So once it forms, the clock starts ticking, and then we can look at it here and go, whoop, there's this much left, so it must have formed here during this time. We've not only done this here on Earth, we've done it with asteroids and meteors, and we've done it on the moon, and this is an excellent form of testing rocks, and there's many different ways, different isotopes we can test as well to validate. There's videos I have linked here on how to do it as well, but the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. So this much we know, which is this many years old. It's very, very old. That is true for not just the Earth, but for all the planets in our particular solar system formed during this time. I'm not going to get too much into this stuff, but if you really want to get into some astronomy, it's really cool stuff. I did take an astrogeology course in college, where we looked at the astronomy of all the different planets, and that was really fun. Okay, so anyway, this is the formation of our solar system. It is a young solar system. The universe itself is at least 14 to 15 billion years old, and maybe older, right? We're still learning about it there. So geologic evidence tells us that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. There's been a lot of time for life to evolve on Earth. Life on Earth showed up about 3.8 billion years ago. And since then, it's been steadily and slowly evolving. When we look back in the fossil record, in the rocks, right, over this long period of time that we have now, we see lots of different examples of animals that have been preserved in the rocks, of organisms, plants too. And we call those fossils. Fossils are the preserved remains of once living organisms. And the fossil record shows a pattern of change over time. When you look down through the layers, you see different types of things that resemble each other but are slightly different. It's a progression. It's a stepwise progression, punctuated periodically by large extinctions. There's been about 3 of those major ones and many small ones in the modern history of life on Earth in the last billion years. Okay, so the fossil record shows a pattern of change over time. All of these photos are photos of different types of whale ancestors. Okay. What are some things we can observe that change over time between these examples? So the first one here, if we go back far enough on the top left, is an organism called Pakicetus. And this is the organism, not this particular one, this population of organisms, are what we think modern whales have evolved from. And modern whales are including things like dolphins and porpoises and killer whales, right, toothed and baleen whales as well. There's 3 different groups of marine mammals, actually, mammals that exist in the water, all of which came from animals on land, right? So seals and sea lions are one specific group. And they have claws and things like that, fingernails. Manatees are another group. They have fingernails as well, actually, and all the mammal parts and hair even. And then whales is another. So we're looking specifically at whales here. What do we see here with the whales that has changed over time? Well, one, these guys have big webbed feet, crocodilian style looking, kind of like a dog and a crocodile. They hunted, the environment they lived in was right along the shore in like lagoons and estuaries, and it was a warm climate when they existed 50 million years ago. These are found around Pakistan, thus the name Pakicetus. Of course, Pakistan today is very dry, but it's all these sedimentary rocks that show this huge, have a great record of fossils throughout them from 50 million years ago when it was warm and wet over there. Okay, so these guys hunting near water, they have a nostril out on the end, but they have a low flat skull similar to a crocodile. They have a lot of other skull features that we see in modern whales today that carry over. And then if we want to jump 30 million years, I think, or so, to this one right in here, we see that the nose is moving backwards. So see the nose hole here, where the nostrils would be? Now it's like halfway up here. So this is moved up. Look at the back legs. They've gotten much smaller, but it still has back legs and feet. Pretty long limbs coming out here still, but they're kind of flattening. Notice how the bones are kind of flattening. Whew. So they're getting a little more paddle-like there. And now to modern whales today. This is a modern killer whale, I believe, right here. And look at where the nose hole is now, right? So the blowhole on a whale is actually the nostril hole. And what's crazy is the nose bones still grow out to the end. Look at these nose bones. They grow all the way to the end. Why does it even have a nose when the nose hole's right here? Well, it's just because the nose bones grow to the end and the hole has slowly moved backwards through time. And we'll talk about natural selection next week and how that works. But if you have 100 of these organisms in a population swimming in the water and hunting, the one with the nose hole furthest back that has to stick its head the least out of water is going to be the best hunter and the most successful. It's going to have the most offspring. And it's going to produce more like it than the one that has the nose down in the front more, that has to stick its nose way out of the water and then doesn't catch as much food. That's in a nutshell. We'll keep going. Over time, over 20 million years, which is a lot of generations, you'll see this thing march back. Generation after generation, a little bit further back, a little bit further back, until we get to today. And no more legs, except for a little tiny floating bone right here. Bigger bone here, full-on legs here. So the fossil records, again, shows us change over time. That's the point of this. And we have a lot of time, right? We have 3.8 billion years for life and 4.5 billion for the entire planet. A lot of changes happen. So if we go back here from Pakicetus, we can go through all of these different examples throughout geologic time, right? 50 million years ago, Ambulocetus, and then right down to modern whales today, which start showing up right around 35, 40 million years ago there. And then the two main groups that we have today, the toothed and the baleen whales. Kind of cool stuff. But we see all of these different examples of things that existed in the past here that no longer exist, that show a slow progression of change over time. And I could talk more about this, different examples of different fossils we see as well that stretch across continents that show that the continents were linked up as one and that the continents have slowly been drifting apart as well. The theory of plate tectonics. Again, the theory is an explanation, right? And the facts are that we have all of these different fossils that link up, that show that there were the same species of plants that crossed all these continents. We don't have that today because in order to have the same species of plants, plants need to be on the same continent. So this was all one continent. We also see that the rock types line up perfectly, right? And they've been split apart, and we have just thousands of pieces of evidence from many different fields. And the theory of plate tectonics explains and makes sense of all of those. Just like the theory of evolution explains and makes sense of all of this stuff, right? The homologous structures, the vestigial structures, the developmental similarities as well. The fact that things show groups and relations to each other, right? That not every living thing is its own, but that they belong into families and groups, like dogs, like cats, like pines. So a good coherent theory explains all the facts and evidence together. That's what a good theory does, right? It doesn't leave some out or only explain half of them, right? It explains all of them in a way that makes sense. And theories change over time because the more facts you get, either the stronger your theory is, right, or the weaker it becomes. And if new facts come in and they line up perfectly with the explanation you have, okay, well, that makes sense because of this, good. And then, if you have a really good theory, you can use it to explain things, to predict things, right? So theories do change based on facts and evidence, but new facts, a good theory, a more solid theory, is well supported by thousands of different facts. And here's where we're at today with this, with the theory of evolution. We have so many different facts that all point to species changing over time. The species have changed over time. That's where we're at. So we're going to look at one other example here. We talked about this actually in class last week, looking at the migration of mammals, right, of giraffes and camels, and where we find them today, right? So we find giraffes and camels, the camel family. We find two different types of camels here and llamas here. They're all in the same family. How can you get two different groups all belonging to the same family in totally different places? Right? How did they get there? Well, they got there because they evolved from a common group of animals here, and then those populations have moved over time and evolved over time and gotten to where they are now, here and here. And now we look and we see llamas, okay, those are over here, but they're still camels, and camels over here, two different types. But originally they came from the ancestral group in the middle, where they migrated from. And we find those in the Badlands of South Dakota. We find early horses, we find early camels, we find early giraffe family members from there as well. So it's a big hotbed for evolution. Here's some of the different giraffes we find scattered across the planet over time. Pretty cool. Look at some of these ones. Most of these are extinct. The ones that exist today are llamas and alpacas, and then the 2-hump and the 1-hump camels. But these are some of the different ones that did exist that have gone extinct. Okay, so another field of science is biogeography. We look at these groups of animals that we see, right? Families of organisms, plants, fungus, animals. And we look at where they live on the planet and the patterns that we see, right? And what makes sense of all the different patterns that we see? Well, one, the Earth is really old, plate tectonics, the Ice Age, and also evolution. Things change over time to fit their environment. Okay, the last piece of evidence that we could look at with seeing if things are related is DNA evidence. So we have all the physical characteristics. We can look at the skulls and compare them and go, oh, these look like camels, right? Now we can do some DNA. And here's the different groups that we have, right? Of camels and then llama alpacas in South America. And we can run the DNA on them and boom, it shows that these guys are very closely related to each other. And no wonder that llamas, alpacas are, in this group down in here, are more closely related to each other than they are to camels. But these two camels are more closely related. But as a whole, these are more closely related than they are to horses, right? Or to giraffes or any other group. It shows relationship and it shows distance of relationship. The same way I can do a cheek swab with DNA and find a third cousin or, right, find my long lost dad. Just kidding. So we can do this with other living things as well, and it shows relationships. So DNA is another method from which we look and see how closely related things are. And all living things here on Earth have DNA and use the same genetic code, A, T, C's, and G's, right? And so these DNA nucleotide sequences, which we've already talked about, can be compared. Species that are more closely related have a more closely related sequence. So it's basically spelled the same way. As humans, we're 99.999% the same. Our DNA sequences are. And then it varies between us a little bit, and then we're 97% chimpanzee, and on and on. We can do this with other types of, not just mammals, right? We can compare our DNA to fish and see how closely related we are to fish. And it turns out we're pretty closely related to fish, actually. Well, I'm more closely related to a fish because I have a backbone than I am to a shrimp. But a shrimp and I are still more closely related because we're animals than I would be to a fern. But I'm actually still fairly closely related to a fern, actually, because we're a eukaryote. We have a very similar cell type. I'm more closely related to a fern than I would be to a bacteria. So we just run down the DNA, and we can see how many differences we have between us in certain sections in genes of our DNA, because we share genes in common as well. Sections of DNA that code for proteins, we share similar proteins. Okay, so looking at a mouse and a coelacanth and a fugu. Coelacanth and fugu are two different types of fish. And it looks, when you run down here, where is the difference? Pretty much all the same. Oh, there's a difference here. So one difference, similar here. Let's keep going down the line. Where's another difference? Oh, difference here. These two are similar here. So the two fish are similar here. The mouse is different. Different here. Oh, these two are closer. And so when we start to compare the differences, we'll see that the mouse and the coelacanth have more in common than the mouse and the fugu do. Right? Just a little bit slightly more. We can run this out for 3 billion and then add them up and see. And it turns out coelacanths are what the group of organisms that amphibians came from. They have limbs very similar to them. They have a skull very similar to them. And amphibians, basically, salamanders walking on 4 legs, still lay eggs like a fish, have gills like fish. So this is sort of that missing group of fish. There's not many of the coelacanths left, actually. They're kind of a living fossil. So mouse to coelacanth, 6 differences. Mouse to fugu, 8 differences. Okay. Species more closely related have closer DNA. We can look at proteins that we share, and we can see how many differences compared to us. So here's a specific protein, cytochrome C. And in this one, we're looking at the amino acids, but DNA codes for every 3 bases codes for a specific amino acid, so that's another way of doing it. 0 difference between us and chimpanzees, 1 difference between us and monkeys, rabbits, cows. We can go down the list. The more differences we get, the further away we are to being related to. In the end, right, we're even getting down to funguses here and fruit flies, which is kind of cool. Okay, from those differences, we can build this tree of life. This tree of life was already built early on using physical differences. How many physical differences you had would put you further away. If you had more in common, you'd be closer together. And scientists built this, right? Starting really in the 1700s with Carl Linnaeus, and then all the way through the 1900s. DNA has now allowed us to create the same diagram just using chemistry, and it completely underlies and matches the one based on physical characteristics. So, cool. Okay, last little bit here. We got 2 different types of evolution we're going to look at. And I'm actually going to stop here, and I'm going to split this and put this onto next week's natural selection. And we're going to stop just with that. Okay, so fill out the note sheet on this. I know there's a lot of information there. Hopefully you showed up to a class meeting and you're just using this as a review, because this is fun stuff and it's fun to talk about. Okay, guys, fill out the note sheet, and that'll be that for this week.